Now wait.
All right. To move forward.
Just push that back.
All right. Things up here on the table related to an era that I'm going to speak about. Some of it are personal family things, some of it are not, but you know, you're welcome to look at those after the program. There were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And I guess I should start by apologizing to all the preachers and the scriptural scholars that might be in attendance today, because I've chosen to take a piece of scripture totally out of context and use it for my own purposes. And I don't think I'm the first person to have ever done that, but hopefully you'll forgive me and somehow see how it ties into the program. I grew up in a military family. My dad joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, and he trained in Texas as a flight engineer with a B-24 bomber group bound for Europe. That's where my dad was supposed to be. That would have been the group he was with. But paperwork snafu, which is typical military, instead he winds up as part of the 345th Boat Company, driving a landing craft in the South Pacific. So, you know, when we used to go to air shows, he'd say, well, that's the plane I was supposed to be in. He was there, drove the landing craft in invasions in New Guinea and the Philippines. And in Manila in the spring of 1945, he actually met up with his brother, Sidney, who was an Army scout and had just come up from Mindanao down in the South. And I can't imagine what that would have been like to two Trinity boys to meet up in Manila in the Philippines as part of an Army. Dad retired from the Air Force in 1964 when I was 6, and I spent my formative years surrounded by him and his brother and their friends, and later 2 uncles who served in Vietnam. Now, these were all men who'd been to places and done things that I just couldn't really imagine doing. I mean, it was so much bigger than what normal people would do, and out of the ordinary for places that they would have come from. I remember when I was about 14, I was in the house and the whole house started shaking. And, you know, we don't have earthquakes around here, not like that anyway. But I ran outside and here's my Uncle Frank landing in the pasture beside our house with 2 UH-1 helicopters. And the crews hop out and they come in and Mom fixes lunch for them. And shortly thereafter, they all deployed to Vietnam. My Uncle Gary, he's probably one of the most soft-spoken, caring and loving people that I've ever met. And you'd never know by looking at him that he was a tunnel rat in Vietnam. My Uncle Frank rescued him. He found him doing in the infantry. He rescued him and had him to the helicopter unit that he was in. And so he learned helicopter maintenance in Vietnam and later retired after 20 years of service in the Air National Guard here in North Carolina. 2 other uncles were in the Air Force. My Uncle Randolph, he retired after 20 years of service in the Air Force. And my Uncle Ronnie, he went on after a short term with the Air Force to become a major in the Charlotte Police Department. And I can remember visiting with them one time, here again back when I was a teenager. And, you know, there's Ronnie, he's in his patrol uniform, and his wife, Nancy, she's a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital. And, you know, she's wearing her whites, which was the typical uniform back then. These were men and women that had stories and histories that were beyond my ability to comprehend. They all came from simple backgrounds, either in the mountains of North Carolina or here in the Trinity Thomasville area. They all grew up poor, but I felt like I grew up around giants. People who had been places that I couldn't imagine and done things that I couldn't imagine doing. One of the stories I want to relate to you today is goes back to World War I and my dad's Uncle Willie, my great uncle. And I want to share that story with you and also tie it into a relatively unknown story of the unnecessary death of over 3,000 Americans in the war to end all wars, or the Great War as it was called. And I want to begin by saying I owe a great debt to Jimmy Tomlin with the High Point Enterprise. It was kind of odd. One of the things I have up here is my uncle's memorial, my great uncle's memorial card, which was given to me by my aunt. And when I was moving things out of my office there at work as I was retiring, my sister called me and said, Jimmy Tomlin wants to talk to you about our great uncle Willie. And he wound up writing a story about him, and he had newspaper articles and things that went back to that era. And so I learned a whole lot from him. But as a result of that article, I was contacted kind of out of the blue by a lady named Connie Hedgecock. She'd seen the article, and she was helping a friend of hers clean out the attic of the friend's house and found a folder with a lot of stuff in it. And she saw the Underwood name, remembered the article, and was kind enough to reach out to me. And she could have just thrown the stuff in the trash. But as a result of her giving me these things, it filled in a whole lot of gaps. And I could remember being there when she handed these things to me, and I'm looking at them, and I'm almost shaking right now. I was literally shaking looking at these things from my family's past. I knew little about Willie Underwood's story until the article came out. What I thought I knew was that he was killed on November the 10th, 1918, hours before the armistice was signed. Dad said that when his body was brought back to the U.S., and Dad wasn't alive at that time, but he said that when his body was brought back, the family opened the casket to make sure it was him. And that's basically all I knew. The Enterprise article filled in a whole lot of gaps. And the pictures, the papers given to me by Connie Hedgecock filled in a lot more. Willie Underwood was born on October 12, 1886, one of 8 kids. He was married to Miss Nita Leonard of High Point on December 17, 1913. She was 18 and he was 27. They were married for almost 3 years when Nita developed appendicitis and died from complications the day after the surgery. She died on March 23, 1917, and the Enterprise described Nita as one of High Point's popular and estimable young women. I've searched everywhere and cannot find a photo of her. I'd really love to see what she looked like. Willie was 31 years old, an employee at the Tomlinson Chair Factory in High Point when his draft notice arrived, and 6 months later, he finds himself on a train to Camp Jackson in South Carolina, preparing to head off to France. As one of the older men in his group, he was named the squad leader and joined the 332nd Infantry 81st Division, which was the Wildcat Division, and deployed to France in the fall of 1918, where he immediately became involved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was one of the bloodiest offensives of the war. A couple of letters arrived home from Willie, one dated June the 20th, where he said that he'd just received a letter from his brother. He was still at Camp Jackson at that time. And the next came from France and is dated September 27, 1918. In this letter, Willie writes, I've seen a lot of this country and I've experienced more than I will write. I know Mom is very anxious to hear from me, but I'm doing the best I can. This would be the last letter that Willie would write. The circumstances of Willie's death are known from a Red Cross letter dated April the 14th, 1919. It states that Willie's unit had advanced near Grenicourt and had sheltered behind an embankment for cover from shelling when an artillery shell struck within about a foot of him, killing him instantly. The Red Cross letter stated that he died on November the 10th, 1918 at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. This letter contradicts the date of the death listed in the telegram, which was sent to his parents, which says the 9th. This same date's listed on a Department of Army certification, the 10th. Yet on Willie's memorial card, the date's listed, the 11th, I'll get it right in a minute, the 9th, but on his memorial card, it says the 10th. So it's a little vague about when he actually died. Was the Red Cross correct or was the Army correct? One of the Enterprise articles that Jimmy Tomlin gave me a copy of was a letter that Willie's brother wrote home to his mother. Tommy was still in Ireland with the U.S. Navy, and I asked Stan to read this for you because I'm not sure I can.
This is written in Queenstown, Ireland. I wish I could be with you today, for I know that you are grieving over Willie. But Mama, we must try to look at it as he would wish for us to. I was not surprised to hear of his death when I received the news, for I had given him up for dead. I don't see how any man could have lived through the last 2 months of the war and can say Willie has done his bit and died a true man's death. He could never have died any nobler than he did, and I know he was glad to go, for he wrote me that he was not afraid of death. If I could only have been with him, is all I regret. We must not worry over his death, for many had to die, and some mothers had to lose their sons, and no one could die for any greater cause than your boy has. Jesus Christ himself died that men might be saved, and Willie has died that men might be free, and that peace might be restored on earth again. We all are going soon. At our best, we can't live long. So let us all be ready to meet our hero brother and son, where he will never say goodbye and where there are no wars. We want to bring his body back and bury him beside Noda, his deceased wife. So be sure you notify the War Department that you want his body and write me all the details of his death. So please don't worry about it, for it was God's will and we can't help it. Of course, we will miss him, and his place can never be restored in our family again. I can't write much this time, but I am well.
Willie Underwood was possibly killed in an avoidable battle in the last days and hours of World War I. 3,200 Americans lost their lives, more than at D-Day in World War II. The armistice was signed on the 5th at 5 a.m. on November the 11th, 1918. But for 6 more hours, commanders continued to order attacks. When the war ended and news of the deaths reached the families and the circumstances, then a lot of families wrote their congressmen demanding answers. Called to testify before the House Armed Services Committee, General John Pershing stated he was simply following orders given to him by his superior, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, commander of Allied forces in France. In the last hours of World War I, both sides fired off virtually every artillery round they had. I guess they didn't want to bring them back home. It's possible that in this expenditure of ammunition, Willie lost his life. But back home, he wasn't forgotten. When his body was returned to High Point on September 17, 1921, the Enterprise ran a story listing him as the last High Pointer killed in World War I. According to the Enterprise, the funeral was attended by over 1,000 people in High Point. Willie now lies beside his wife, Nita, at the Oakwood Cemetery. And this leads me back now to where I started. There were giants in the earth. Excuse me. There were giants in the earth in those days. Mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And I'll take first the scripture since we botched it up so good for you here. There are giants in the earth in these days, mighty men and women of renown. As a child, I grew up in awe of the men and women in my family. They were giants. Today, we're still surrounded by giants. Most times, we don't recognize them. We pass them at the post office or at the grocery store. They're men and women of age who face things that we can't imagine. They've gone places we've never been. But there's young giants as well. People who are doing incredible things, which very often go unseen and unnoticed. Men and women to whom we owe a great debt that we can never repay. Some of those giants are seated in here today. I'm thankful for my family heritage, and I'm thankful for the men and women and the families who've sacrificed so much through the ages. And for all who have served and serve today, I thank you. Thank you, folks.